Hello, this is my voice, from the person reading word by word what Kant wrote to us.
Hello, my friend, and this is my voice, from the person explaining part by part what Kant wrote. Shall we begin?
Preface to the first edition, 1781. Human reason, in one sphere of its cognition, is called upon to consider questions which it cannot decline as they are presented by its own nature, but which it cannot answer as they transcend every faculty of the mind.
Kant starts with a paradox. Reason can't help asking certain ultimate questions about first causes, the whole of reality, the soul, God, freedom. These questions feel unavoidable because they arise from reason's own drive to explain things completely. But they also exceed what our cognitive powers can legitimately settle, so reason hits a ceiling.
It falls into this difficulty without any fault of its own.
Kant is saying, when reason gets stuck in big ultimate questions, it's not because people are dumb or careless. The human mind is simply built in a way that leads it there. The problem is structural, not personal.
It begins with principles which cannot be dispensed with in the field of experience, and the truth and sufficiency of which are, at the same time, ensured by experience.
We start with basic rules of thinking that are necessary for everyday life and science, like expecting order, consistency, and explanation. In ordinary experience, those rules seem safe because they work. They help us make sense of what happens and predict outcomes.
With these principles, it rises, in obedience to the laws of its own nature, to ever higher and more remote conditions.
Once reason has a working principle, it naturally pushes further. If something happens, reason asks what makes it happen. If something is conditioned, it asks for its condition. In other words, explanation creates momentum. Reason keeps climbing toward deeper grounds and more general accounts.
But it quickly discovers that in this way, its labors must remain ever incomplete, because new questions never cease to present themselves.
The trouble is that the questioning never ends. Every answer creates a new question. Reason wants a final stopping point, but it can't find one just by following the chain of explanations.
And thus it finds itself compelled to have recourse to principles which transcend the region of experience, while they are regarded by common sense without distrust.
So the mind reaches beyond what we can actually experience and test. It starts using big ideas like a first cause, a complete explanation of everything, or an ultimate reality. And most people accept these ideas easily because they feel like the natural way to finish the story.
It thus falls into confusion and contradictions, from which it conjectures the presence of latent errors, which, however, it is unable to discover.
But once you go beyond experience, you lose your usual reality check. In science, you can test claims. In everyday life, you can verify things. Here, you can't. So reason starts producing contradictions and endless debates without a clear way to prove who's right.
Because the principles it employs, transcending the limits of experience, cannot be tested by that criterion.
But once you go beyond experience, you lose your usual reality check. In science, you can test claims. In everyday life, you can verify things. Here, you can't. So reason starts producing contradictions and endless debates without a clear way to prove who's right.
The arena of these endless contests is called metaphysic.
Kant defines metaphysics as the zone where reason fights with itself. It's where we argue about ultimate questions, often intelligently, often passionately, yet rarely settle anything decisively.
Time was when she was the queen of all the sciences, and if we take the will for the deed, she certainly deserves, so far as regards the high importance of her object matter, this title of honor.
Kant says metaphysics used to be treated as the highest discipline, the one that tells you what reality ultimately is. If the goal is to answer the biggest questions, metaphysics sounds like it deserves the crown.
Now it is the fashion of the time to heap contempt and scorn upon her, and the matron mourns, forlorn and forsaken like Hecuba. I once was ruler in the highest station of all things, mighty in lineage and in children. Now I am dragged away, an exile, destitute. Ovid, Metamorphoses, Book 8.
But by Kant's time, people are tired of metaphysics. It has a reputation for making grand claims and then collapsing into disagreement. So the queen is now mocked, seen as outdated or embarrassing.
At first, her government, under the administration of the dogmatists, was an absolute despotism.
Dogmatists are philosophers who claimed certainty too quickly. They built metaphysical systems as if they were delivering final truth. Kant calls it despotism because it's like ruling by decree, asserting big conclusions without first proving the right to make them.
But as the legislative continued to show traces of the ancient barbaric rule, her empire gradually broke up, and intestine wars introduced the reign of anarchy.
Over time, those confident systems didn't unify knowledge. They split into rival camps. Metaphysics turned into internal warfare, competing theories, no shared method, no stable agreement. That is what Kant calls anarchy.
While the skeptics, like nomadic tribes who hate a permanent habitation and settled mode of living, attacked from time to time those who had organized themselves into civil communities.
Then come the skeptics who challenge everyone's claims and doubt the possibility of metaphysical knowledge at all. Kant compares them to nomads. They don't want to build a settled city of theory. They raid the settled systems and expose weaknesses.
But their number was, very happily, small, and thus they could not entirely put a stop to the exertions of those who persisted in raising new edifices, although on no settled or uniform plan.
Skeptics didn't fully stop metaphysics because most thinkers kept rebuilding anyway. The problem is that the rebuilding lacked a common blueprint, so people constructed new buildings of theory, but not on a stable foundation.
In recent times, the hope dawned upon us of seeing those disputes settled, and the legitimacy of her claims established by a kind of physiology of the human understanding, that of the celebrated Locke.
Kant says Locke brought a new hope. Instead of guessing about ultimate reality, examine how the human mind works, where our ideas come from, and what we can legitimately claim. It's like saying, before we argue about reality, let's inspect the instrument of knowledge.
But it was found that, although it was affirmed that this so-called queen could not refer her descent to any higher source than that of common experience, a circumstance which necessarily brought suspicion on her claims, as this genealogy was incorrect, she persisted in the advancement of her claims to sovereignty. Thus, metaphysics necessarily fell back into the antiquated and rotten constitution of dogmatism, and again became obnoxious to the contempt from which efforts had been made to save it.
Kant thinks Locke's attempt was important but flawed. If you base everything on experience in the wrong way, you don't actually resolve metaphysics. You just weaken it without clarifying its real limits. So, metaphysics falls back into the old pattern: big claims, shaky justification, renewed ridicule.
At present, as all methods, according to the general persuasion, have been tried in vain, there reigns naught but weariness and complete indifferentism, the mother of chaos and night in the scientific world. But at the same time, the source of, or at least the prelude to, the recreation and reinstallation of a science, when it has fallen into confusion, obscurity, and disuse from ill-directed effort.
Now we hit the mood Kant is describing. People are exhausted. After so many failed systems, many stop caring and decide metaphysical questions are pointless. Kant calls this indifference a kind of intellectual burnout.
For it is in reality vain to profess indifference in regard to such inquiries, the object of which cannot be indifferent to humanity.
Kant says, nice try, but you can't truly be indifferent. These questions matter to human beings about freedom, meaning, God, the soul, the world as a whole. Even if you avoid metaphysics, it tends to come back.
Besides, these pretended indifferentists, however much they may try to disguise themselves by the assumption of a popular style and by changes on the language of the schools, unavoidably fall into metaphysical declarations and propositions, which they profess to regard with so much contempt.
Even people who claim to hate metaphysics often make metaphysical claims without noticing. For example, saying, only science gives truth, or everything is just matter, or morality is only a social construct. And those are not laboratory results. They're philosophical commitments.
At the same time, this indifference, which has arisen in the world of science, and which relates to that kind of knowledge which we should wish to see destroyed the last, is a phenomenon that well deserves our attention and reflection. It is plainly not the effect of the levity, but of the matured judgment of the age. Footnote 1, see it in the final, which refuses to be any longer entertained with illusory knowledge.
Kant gives the age some credit. The indifference is not just laziness. It's a more serious judgment that the old metaphysics offered illusory knowledge, claims that sounded impressive but didn't hold up. The public is no longer easily entertained by that.
It is, in fact, a call to reason, again to undertake the most laborious of all tasks, that of self-examination, and to establish a tribunal which may secure it in its well-grounded claims, while it pronounces against all baseless assumptions and pretensions, not in an arbitrary manner, but according to its own eternal and unchangeable laws.
This is Kant's proposal. Instead of either one, dogmatically claiming metaphysical truths, or two, giving up entirely, reason should put itself on trial. We need rules and a method that decide what reason can legitimately claim and what it must stop pretending to know.
This tribunal is nothing less than the critical investigation of pure reason.
That tribunal is the critique of pure reason itself. Kant's goal is not to kill metaphysics, but to discipline it, to set boundaries, explain why certain debates never end, and show what knowledge is actually possible for beings like us.
I do not mean by this a criticism of books and systems, but a critical inquiry into the faculty of reason, with reference to the cognitions to which it strives to attain without the aid of experience.
Kant says critique does not mean reviewing other philosophers. He means an investigation of reason itself, what the mind can know without relying on experience. No experiments, no observation. He wants to find out whether metaphysics is possible at all, and if it is, what its limits are.
In other words, the solution of the question regarding the possibility or impossibility of metaphysics, and the determination of the origin, as well as of the extent and limits of this science. All this must be done on the basis of principles.
He is trying to answer, can we have real knowledge about ultimate reality, or is it impossible? If it's possible, where does it come from, and how far can it go? And he insists this can't be settled by vibes or tradition. It must be settled by clear principles, like a rigorous audit.
This path, the only one now remaining, has been entered upon by me, and I flatter myself that I have in this way discovered the cause of, and consequently the mode of removing, all the errors which have hitherto set reason at variance with itself, in the sphere of non-empirical thought.
Kant claims most metaphysical confusion comes from a specific kind of mistake, using reason beyond where it can safely operate. He thinks he has identified the root cause, so the errors aren't random. They can be diagnosed and treated.
I have not returned an evasive answer to the questions of reason by alleging the inability and limitation of the faculties of the mind. I have, on the contrary, examined them completely in the light of principles, and, after having discovered the cause of the doubts and contradictions into which reason fell, have solved them to its perfect satisfaction.
He is not saying humans are limited, so stop asking. Instead, he wants to examine exactly what the limits are and why contradictions happen, then resolve those contradictions by showing where reason overreaches.
It is true, these questions have not been solved as dogmatism, in its vain fancies and desires, had expected, for it can only be satisfied by the exercise of magical arts, and of these I have no knowledge. But neither do these come within the compass of our mental powers.
Kant says if you expected metaphysics to deliver dramatic final answers, like a magician pulling certainty out of thin air, you'll be disappointed. Those miracle solutions are not available to human minds. Real philosophy must work within what our cognition can actually do.
And it was the duty of philosophy to destroy the illusions which had their origin in misconceptions, whatever darling hopes and valued expectations may be ruined by its explanations.
Indeed, philosophy must sometimes kill comforting illusions.
My chief aim in this work has been thoroughness, and I make bold to say that there is not a single metaphysical problem that does not find its solution, or at least the key to its solution, here.
Kant makes a strong promise. This book contains either answers, or at least the method for answering every major metaphysical problem.
Pure reason is a perfect unity, and therefore, if the principle presented by it proved to be insufficient for the solution of even a single one of those questions to which the very nature of reason gives birth, we must reject it, as we could not be perfectly certain of its sufficiency in the case of the others.
He treats reason like a single system. If your theory of reason fails even one essential test, it casts doubt on the whole theory. So he is aiming for a framework that holds together consistently across all the big questions reason naturally produces.
While I say this, I think I see upon the countenance of the reader signs of dissatisfaction mingled with contempt when he hears declarations which sound so boastful and extravagant, and yet they are beyond comparison more moderate than those advanced by the commonest author of the commonest philosophical program, in which the dogmatist professes to demonstrate the simple nature of the soul, or the necessity of a primal being.
Kant anticipates the reader rolling their eyes. That's a huge claim. But he says it's actually more modest than the typical metaphysician who claims to prove things like the soul's simplicity or God's necessity.
Such a dogmatist promises to extend human knowledge beyond the limits of possible experience, while I humbly confess that this is completely beyond my power.
Kant draws a line. He refuses to claim knowledge of what no possible experience could confirm. He is not trying to expand human knowledge into the beyond. He is trying to explain what knowledge is possible and then what is not.
Instead of any such attempt, I confine myself to the examination of reason alone and its pure thought, and I do not need to seek far for the sum total of its cognition, because it has its seat in my own mind.
His method is inward. To study pure reason, you do not need to travel the world collecting data. The material is right here, the structures and operations of thinking that we can examine in ourselves.
Besides, common logic presents me with a complete and systematic catalog of all the simple operations of reason, and it is my task to answer the question how far reason can go, without the material presented and the aid furnished by experience.
Logic already lists the basic moves reason makes: judging, inferring, connecting ideas. Kant's job is to ask, how far can those moves take us on their own? What can reason establish a priori, and where does it start inventing illusions?
So much for the completeness and thoroughness necessary in the execution of the present task. The aims set before us are not arbitrarily proposed, but are imposed upon us by the nature of cognition itself.
Kant insists he didn't choose this project just for fun. The mind itself forces these questions. If humans seek knowledge, we inevitably run into the problem of what reason can and cannot do.
The above remarks relate to the matter of our critical inquiry. As regards the form, there are two indispensable conditions, which anyone who undertakes so difficult a task as that of a critique of pure reason is bound to fulfill. These conditions are certitude and clearness.
Kant says the work must meet two standards. It must be certain, not guesswork. And it must be clear, not muddy rhetoric. He is setting expectations for a strict style of argument.
As regards certitude, I have fully convinced myself that in this sphere of thought, opinion is perfectly inadmissible, and that everything which bears the least semblance of an hypothesis must be excluded, as of no value in such discussions.
In this domain, Kant doesn't want maybe arguments. He's claiming that if you are establishing what reason can know beforehand, then you cannot rely on plausible hypotheses. You need necessity, not probability.
For it is a necessary condition of every cognition that is to be established upon a priori grounds that it shall be held to be absolutely necessary. Much more is this the case with an attempt to determine all pure a priori cognition and to furnish the standard and consequently an example of all apodeictic certitude.
He is saying if a claim is truly a priori, it must have a must-be-so character. That level of certainty, what he calls apodeictic, is the gold standard here. If the argument doesn't reach necessity, it doesn't belong in the critique.
Whether I have succeeded in what I profess to do, it is for the reader to determine. It is the author's business merely to adduce grounds and reasons without determining what influence these ought to have on the mind of his judges. But lest anything he may have said may become the innocent cause of doubt in their minds, or tend to weaken the effect which his arguments might otherwise produce, he may be allowed to point out those passages which may occasion mistrust or difficulty, although these do not concern the main purpose of the present work. He does this solely with the view of removing from the mind of the reader any doubts which might affect his judgment of the work as a whole and in regard to its ultimate aim.
He adds a practical note. If some passages might confuse readers or create unnecessary doubts, he wants to flag them, not because they're central, but because misunderstandings can make people reject the project prematurely. He wants the reader to judge the main argument fairly.
I know no investigations more necessary for a full insight into the nature of the faculty which we call understanding, and at the same time for the determination of the rules and limits of its use, than those undertaken in the second chapter of the Transcendental Analytic, under the title of Deduction of the Pure Conceptions of the Understanding. And they have also cost me by far the greatest labor which I hope will not remain uncompensated.
Kant is warning you. The hardest part of the book is coming. The deduction is where he tries to justify the basic concepts your mind uses to think about objects. Concepts like cause, substance, unity, and so on.
The view there taken, which goes somewhat deeply into the subject, has two sides.
He says there are two angles to that argument. One is about the concepts themselves and whether they really apply to objects. The other is about the mind and how it is even able to know things.
The one relates to the objects of the pure understanding and is intended to demonstrate and to render comprehensible the objective validity of its a priori conceptions. And it forms for this reason an essential part of the critique.
This is the main point. Kant wants to prove that certain concepts we use are not just habits or words, but actually valid for experience. He wants to show why concepts like cause legitimately apply to what we perceive, even though we don't see causality with our eyes.
The other considers the pure understanding itself, its possibility and its powers of cognition. That is, from a subjective point of view. And although this exposition is of great importance, it does not belong essentially to the main purpose of the work, because the grand question is what and how much can reason and understanding, apart from experience, cognize and not, how is the faculty of thought itself possible?
The subjective side asks how the mind works internally to make knowledge possible. Kant says that is important, but it is not his central mission here. His central mission is, what can we know without experience?
As the latter is an inquiry into the cause of a given effect, and has thus in it some semblance of an hypothesis, although, as I shall show on another occasion, this is really not the fact. It would seem that in the present instance, I had allowed myself to announce a mere opinion, and that the reader must therefore be at liberty to hold a different opinion.
Explaining how thought is possible can look like guessing about hidden mechanisms, like a theory about causes we can't directly observe. Kant acknowledges that some readers might treat that part as less convincing, because it can feel speculative.
But I beg to remind him that if my subjective deduction does not produce in his mind the conviction of its certitude at which I aimed, the objective deduction with which alone the present work is properly concerned is in every respect satisfactory. As regards clearness, the reader has a right to demand, in the first place, discursive or logical clearness, that is, on the basis of conceptions, and secondly, intuitive or aesthetic clearness, by means of intuitions, that is, by examples or other modes of illustration in concreto.
Kant distinguishes two kinds of clarity. First, clarity through careful definitions and logical steps. Second, clarity through examples, illustrations, concrete cases, the kind that makes ideas feel obvious.
I have done what I could for the first kind of intelligibility. This was essential to my purpose, and it thus became the accidental cause of my inability to do complete justice to the second requirement. I have been almost always at a loss during the progress of this work how to settle this question.
He admits he focused on the first kind, tight logical explanation, and did less of the second kind, examples. He knows this makes the book harder for beginners, but he thinks it was necessary for his main goal.
Examples and illustrations always appeared to me necessary, and in the first sketch of the critique, naturally fell into their proper places. But I very soon became aware of the magnitude of my task, and the numerous problems with which I should be engaged. And as I perceived that this critical investigation would, even if delivered in the driest scholastic manner, be far from being brief, I found it unadvisable to enlarge it still more with examples and explanations, which are necessary only from a popular point of view. I was induced to take this course from the consideration also that the present work is not intended for popular use, that those devoted to science do not require such helps, although they are always acceptable, and that they would have materially interfered with my present purpose.
Kant says he wanted to add more examples, but the project became too large. If he added the popular clarifications, the book would become even longer and harder to finish. So he chose to keep it lean, even if that costs accessibility.
Abbé Terrasson remarks with great justice that if we estimate the size of a work, not from the number of its pages, but from the time which we require to make ourselves master of it, it may be said of many a book that it would be much shorter if it were not so short.
This is a joke with teeth. A book can be short, but still take forever to understand. Dense writing compresses the pages, but expands the effort required from the reader.
On the other hand, as regards the comprehensibility of a system of speculative cognition connected under a single principle, we may say, with equal justice, many a book would have been much clearer if it had not been intended to be so very clear.
Another paradox, sometimes trying too hard to clarify every detail makes the whole picture harder to see. Too many explanations can scatter attention and prevent the reader from grasping the overall structure.
For explanations and examples and other helps to intelligibility aid us in the comprehension of parts, but they distract the attention, dissipate the mental power of the reader, and stand in the way of his forming a clear conception of the whole. As he cannot attain soon enough to a survey of the system, and the coloring and embellishments bestowed upon it prevent his observing its articulation or organization, which is the most important consideration with him when he comes to judge of its unity and stability.
Kant's claim is, examples help you understand individual pieces, but they can break the system into fragments. He wants you to see the architecture of the argument as a whole.
The reader must naturally have a strong inducement to cooperate with the present author if he has formed the intention of erecting a complete and solid edifice of metaphysical science, according to the plan now laid before him.
Kant asks for an active reader. He is not offering entertainment. He is inviting you into construction work.
Metaphysics, as here represented, is the only science which admits of completion, and with little labor if it is united in a short time, so that nothing will be left to future generations except the task of illustrating and applying it didactically.
Kant thinks metaphysics can be finished, unlike sciences that keep discovering new facts. Why? Because metaphysics, in his view, is about what reason itself contributes, not about new data from the world. Bold.
For this science is nothing more than the inventory of all that is given us by pure reason, systematically arranged.
He describes metaphysics as an inventory, a complete list of what the mind can generate from its own principles. If the source is reason itself, then in principle the list can be complete, because we are cataloging our own equipment.
Nothing can escape our notice, for what reason produces from itself cannot lie concealed, but must be brought to the light by reason itself, so soon as we have discovered the common principle of the ideas we seek.
Kant is saying you won't miss anything once you find the master key, the central principle that organizes the whole system. When you know how reason generates these ideas, reason can expose itself fully.
The perfect unity of this kind of cognitions, which are based upon pure conceptions and uninfluenced by any empirical element or any peculiar intuition leading to determinate experience, renders this completeness not only practicable, but also necessary.
Because the system is purely about reason's own concepts, not contingent facts. It should hang together as one unified structure.
Live with yourself, and you will know how meager your household goods really are. Persius, Satires, Book 4, line 52.
This quote is Kant's way of saying, if you look closely at what you actually have in your mental house, you'll see it's not infinite.
Such a system of pure speculative reason I hope to be able to publish under the title of Metaphysic of Nature.
Spoiler, Kant never published it.
The content of this work, which will not be half so long, will be very much richer than that of the present critique, which has to discover the sources of this cognition and expose the conditions of its possibility, and at the same time to clear and level a fit foundation for the scientific edifice.
Kant says the critique is groundwork. It digs foundations and checks which materials are legitimate. Later, he hopes to write a shorter but richer book that actually presents the finished system, metaphysics built properly. Then, he repeats the metaphor. This book is not the palace. It's the engineering report and foundation work. It tells you what metaphysics can be and prevents you from building on sand.
In the present work, I look for the patient hearing and the impartiality of a judge. In the other, for the goodwill and assistance of a co-laborer. For however complete the list of principles for this system may be in the critique, the correctness of the system requires that no deduced conceptions should be absent. These cannot be presented a priori, but must be gradually discovered. And while the synthesis of conceptions has been fully exhausted in the critique, it is necessary that, in the proposed work, the same should be the case with their analysis. But this will be rather an amusement than a labor.
He claims the hardest part is building the framework, that is the critique. Once the structure is secure, working out the details will be easier, more like organizing and applying rather than fighting to justify the foundations. Filling out the full list of derived ideas of the framework takes careful work over time. This is how he finished the preface for the first edition from 1781.
Footnote 1. We very often hear complaints of the shallowness of the present age and of the decay of profound science. But I do not think that those which rest upon a secure foundation, such as mathematics, physical science, etc., in the least deserve this reproach, but that they rather maintain their ancient fame, and in the latter case, indeed, far surpass it. The same would be the case with the other kinds of cognition, if their principles were but firmly established. In the absence of this security, indifference, doubt, and finally, severe criticism are rather signs of a profound habit of thought. Our age is the age of criticism, to which everything must be subjected. The sacredness of religion and the authority of legislation are by many regarded as grounds of exemption from the examination of this tribunal. But if they are exempted, they become the subjects of just suspicion and cannot lay claim to sincere respect, which reason accords only to that which has stood the test of a free and public examination.
Kant's point here is basically this. If a field has solid foundations, clear rules for proof, testing, and correction, then it won't become shallow. Mathematics and the natural sciences keep their depth and even grow because they have dependable methods. Philosophy and metaphysics, by contrast, often look stagnant because their basic principles are contested, so people drift into doubt or even indifference. But Kant says that this skepticism is not necessarily intellectual laziness. It can be a sign of maturity, refusing to accept claims without proper justification. That is why he calls his era an age of criticism. Everything should be examined, including religion and law. If any institution claims it must be exempt from scrutiny just because it is sacred or authoritative, that exemption itself becomes a reason to suspect it. For Kant, genuine respect is earned only by what can survive open, public, free examination.
End of preface to the first edition.
See you in the next video.
About the introduction. First part of the difference between pure and empirical knowledge. Have a good rest.